iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Welcome to another part of our iHeartPodcast speaker series. As you guys know, we like to pause every week and have a conversation with one of our creators, one of our podcasters. And it's a great time to step back from it all and to think about why we do what we do and to talk about some of our great projects. And today is no exception. I'm super excited to get the chance to talk to, honestly, one of my idols in the space. It's hard to believe that Tenderfoot TV started in only 2016, given everything that they've accomplished, probably 10, 11 number one hits, going back to the early days of Up and Vanished, Atlanta Monster, Radio Rental, To Live and Die in LA. The list goes on. So many amazing podcasts. The co-founder of that podcast production company is Donald Albright, who is here with us today. Donald, thanks for taking the time today.
Will, thanks for having me. And I can't possibly live up to all those great things you just said, but I appreciate it.
You can. It's just been a pleasure to watch what you guys have accomplished. And we're going to talk in just a second about your new podcast. But of course, we're here to talk about the MLK tapes. But I do, just for those that may not be as familiar with everything that you and Payne have been up to over the years, I want to go back to, and like I said, it was hard to believe when I looked and saw that it was just 2016 when you guys started Tenderfoot, because you guys have done so much over the years here. But I wanted to go back to those early days. If you could just remind us how you guys got to know each other, how you decided to get into podcasting, just sort of how this whole thing started for you guys.
Yeah, sure. This thing started for myself and Payne. We got together probably in around 2010 or 11. I was a manager in the music industry. Payne was making music videos. We connected, and he sent me some of his work. We started working together on music video projects for my artists. That really, as my roster of talent in the music industry grew, I was able to provide him with more opportunities to shoot, more videos, bigger budget videos. We started to do on tour together, domestically, then internationally. So we really built like this creative and business working relationship over several years, probably about 5-6 years before we actually started Tenderfoot. And it wasn't, the start of Tenderfoot it's not like we really sat down one day and said, man, we want to get into the podcast space and start a podcast production studio and take over the industry. It was really a stepping stone is how we looked at podcasting. And because we didn't really understand the business, we never created in that space before. And, Payne had the idea that he wanted to, as a creator, he was kind of burnt out of making music videos for other people's vision. And he said, I want to make a true crime documentary. I want to make The Jinx. I want to make Making a Murderer. And he said, in order to do that, I got to find a case. And he found the case of a missing teacher from South Georgia named Tara Grinstead. And he quickly realized that between he and I, we had no relationships in Hollywood to make a documentary. Yeah. So based on the success of Serial, he said, we should just make this into a podcast. And I was like, sure. Like, I don't really never heard of podcast. I kind of know what it is, but I never made one before. I never even listened to one before. But yeah, let's go for it. And I finally ended up listening to Serial, and then the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh wow, I see how this can be just as good as The Jinx and just as good as Making a Murderer. So he really took us down that early journey of creating Up and Vanished, making it an audio series, and then it still wasn't a business to us. It was still just a way for us to get the attention of Hollywood so we can get greenlit on making a doc. But we realized that this is a special medium, a space to really create content. You can tell stories in a different way, in a very engaging way. There's, the podcast listening audience is second to none in terms of their dedication and their willingness to actually go out there and promote the fact that you have a show that's trying to do something like solve a crime, right? And it was a very different experience. So we realized, after a few months when Up and Vanished started to blow up, that like, man, this is the space we should stay in and create more in this space, and not really, we still have our eyes set on making TV and film, which we started to do actually, but podcasting is now our prime, place that we want to continue to create in.
Yeah, and that user or that listener engagement and that passion I think you guys got to see that really early with Up and Vanished. And if you can remind our viewers and listeners here today, just how that podcast, like you guys had to be nimble and just fantastic journalists along the way, because you didn't know exactly where the story was going. If you could just remind everybody here sort of how that played out, that was just pretty incredible for you guys to be able to put that together in the very first podcast that you worked on.
Yeah, it was pretty wild, that whole journey. Payne was like a one-man band making Up and Vanished. And then I started to come in as like the podcast was ready to start to release, and an ear for him to like bounce ideas off of, go down to that small town of Wasilla to, attend press conferences and things like that. But it was a very small unit. We released the first episode and got about like 5,000 downloads. We were amazed by the amount of downloads. We couldn't believe it. Like we had no expectation of what, nothing, didn't know what to expect at all from downloads, monetization, anything. We didn't know anything about it. And as it started to grow in this, this small town of 3,000 people, that was like our target market. We said, if we can get those 3,000 people, then we can get, the county, and then South Georgia, and then all of Georgia, and then really expand from there. And they, it worked, and people started to listen. The listeners started to grow, and we started getting more national attention. And we were in over our heads. We were producing one episode every 2 weeks, and then had like a bonus episode in between. And it got to the point where, there were like 6 episodes produced, and now it was like produce, release, all in like 1 week. And the case then started to evolve. So you had people calling in saying, hey, I was around at that time. My uncle was the sheriff. My uncle went to the scene, and we started like literally getting tips on a Monday, and it would make the episode the next Monday. So it was like a real-time investigation, which created some really bad habits for like Tenderfoot production. Like, because we now know that we can do that. So we always leave a little bit of room in our releases. We're like, hey, anything can happen. So we got to be prepared to produce in season and release on a real frequent basis. So I think without doing it that way, it wouldn't have had the impact that it had, because people really felt they could help solve this case literally the next week. You know what I mean? So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I know you're saying it's created some bad habits, and at the same time, like I think it's really been amazing to watch you guys again sort of be nimble and able to pivot when you learn new information. I know we certainly saw that on our first project together with Atlanta Monster. Just the ability to follow the story as it unfolds and just put together an incredible podcast. It's funny to hear you talk about getting 5,000 downloads an episode or something like that. I was looking up the numbers the other day. It probably won't be long here before you guys are knocking on 1 billion downloads across your various shows, which is just phenomenal. I mean, talk about what that feels like to, at this point, have been able to build a roster of shows that just have this mega fan base coming to it.
Yeah, it's like we haven't really processed it, and I don't know if we really will ever like completely understand, because it's one thing to like have your sight set on something, and then to finally get there and you're like, man, I've been waiting for this. But like, we had no concept of what success was. You know what I mean? We didn't know we could make money at this. We didn't know what if 5,000 downloads was great. Like, I have emails dating, in 2016, 2017, I was sending out to like press, to friends of mine in the music industry saying, hey, I'm doing this podcast thing now. And like every email, it says like, man, we're about to hit 100,000 downloads. And I'm like amazed by this number. And then it's like, yo, we're about to hit 500,000 downloads. Then we hit 1 million downloads, and we were like, it can't get any better than this. Yeah. And now the show's at like 350 million downloads or something like that. And we're over like 650 as a company. And it's just, I don't know how to process that, because it's like, it's such a big number, and we never thought we would ever get to 1 million. So like, how do you rationalize that in your own mind?
It does get to a point, because you're right. I mean, 100,000 downloads, 500,000 downloads, like those are real and numbers to celebrate. So it's pretty amazing to see where you've gotten with this. One of the things I love about how you guys approach storytelling, and true crime in particular, is that it's not enough for you guys just to tell the story of a crime that was committed. It feels like you guys always step back from that a bit and ask yourself the question, why would we tell this story? It's not about just talking about a crime for the sake of talking about a crime. There's often a very real sort of historical reason or an understanding of what happened in history, and a bigger picture to how you approach the stories that you tell. Again, I first experienced that when we started talking about the, Atlanta Monster and the terrible child disappearances that happened during the story there, and so many others. Talk about how you guys think about stories before you say, like, let's go after this. Is that something that you guys talk about when you decide which stories you're looking to pursue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the early stages, I mean, Payne found the case of Terry Grinstead. It was a case in Georgia, and we knew we had limited resources. He knew he needed to find a case that he could drive to and not like have to fly to, right? So there were only so many cases. He happened to pick one that was solvable. We didn't know that at the time, but his grandmother lived in the area. His grandmother actually is in the podcast and was at the actual event, the last event that Terry Grinstead went to before she disappeared. She knew about this disappearance. So there was some tie-in to like to Payne and his family and their relationship to that area. So, and that was kind of the one thing we needed to go on. From there, with the success of Vanished, we realized like there's now a responsibility. We have all these ears that are waiting on the next story. And when I just asked Payne one day about Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders, had he ever heard of it before? Because it's something I had heard of all my life, and it happened. I was a kid when it actually, no, I wasn't. It happened in the late. I was really young, 3 years old or so when this was happening. So I couldn't possibly remember, but I remember the stories that came out of that time. And even later when Wayne Williams was already arrested, and Payne had never heard of it before. And I think it was a generational gap, and just culturally in the Black community, about the Atlanta child murders. And so we took the opportunity to say, look, if Payne as a millennial white male didn't know about these crimes, how many others are there? How could it mean so much to me and he not know about it at all? So we said, how do we bridge that gap between kind of my experience and his experience, and open this case up to a lot of ears and a lot of people who just don't know about it and probably should. And we kind of always try to make the point that every case is unique, and we try to find the cases that either are lacking in attention or are lacking in an accurate information being out there, and try to make the point that if there can be 20 JonBenet Ramsey documentaries, there can be multiple projects on the Atlanta child murders. We're talking about 29 young Black victims that deserve every bit of attention that all these other cases are getting.
Yeah. And it felt like you guys were pushing conversations in a way that we weren't necessarily doing as a society until the past 2-3 years, that you guys were sort of ahead of many of those conversations. So, well, let's talk about the newest podcast, the MLK tapes, which, by the way, yet another podcast that hit #1 on the chart. So congratulations
Thank you
on seeing that. Let's talk a little bit about that, because, you and I were talking about this not too long ago, but as kids, growing up in the South, going to school and learning about our history and certain events that happened, this was one of those moments or those assassinations that was just, it was what it was, right? There's a guy that didn't like somebody else. He just shot him. And that was sort of the end of the story. You had James Earl Ray assassinating Martin Luther King. And that was sort of all there was to it. And when you guys first started talking about this podcast over a year or so ago, I was so intrigued by that, because I really knew so little about the broader story. And you and I were also talking about the fact that this sort of brought to light so many interesting things about Dr. King himself that we've sort of forgotten from history. But to back up from that for a second, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to take on this story? Like, what was the origin of this podcast?
Yeah, I think the main thing when looking at a story is, who's the storyteller? What's the perspective of the story? Like, where's that story coming from? What's the perspective? And Bill Klaber hosted the RFK tapes podcast. It was a great podcast. I listened to it, big fan. He emailed me, and that it was instant credibility. I knew this guy was a great writer, great podcast host, great researcher. And I had already heard his voice kind of come through my, earbuds telling me a great story. So I was already intrigued. And then when you said, hey, I came across a bunch of audio while doing the RFK tapes that's directly related to Dr. King's assassination. And I think I want to do this podcast. There's a podcast here that we can call the MLK tapes. So instantly I said, okay, well, I'm already in because it's Bill Claver, but what's the story? Like, what are we talking about? What is that audio?
Yeah.
When he started to explain it to me, I felt what I felt in that moment is what I wanted this podcast to communicate. I wanted all listeners to feel the way I was feeling in that moment, which was, wow, I know so little about something that I thought I knew so much about.
Yep.
And I think we kind of, because information is readily available to us, and because something is like promoted to us, MLK Day, it's, Martin Luther King Jr. is the like acceptable civil rights leader, right? That, that there's a federal holiday, every state recognizes his birthday now. And so you feel almost like, oh, I know everything about that. I was taught, he's the face of the civil rights movement, and he's constantly promoted now, by the same institutions that were trying to take him down, 50 or so years ago. But because he's so out front, we think we know more about him than we actually do. And the truth is, we know very little about not only his death and his assassination, but his life and his legacy, what he actually stood for. We're so caught up in a few lines from I Have a Dream that we don't really understand what his actual message was. We just know what's the message that was promoted to us. And I felt like it does a disservice to his legacy if we only know this, if we only know this 1% of it, but we walk around acting as if we know everything that there is to know about him.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to know from you, like, what do you feel like you've learned about Dr. King through the process of putting the podcast together that you feel like you didn't know before?
I think the main thing is we assume that we know what he's the main thing that we know he stood for was civil rights, and
right.
We assume that, and we know that he was assassinated. We know he was assassinated by James Earl Ray. And we were told it was because James Earl Ray was a racist. So why was he killed? He must have been killed because of his stance on civil rights. And if you heard more than I Have a Dream, or just even heard more lines from I Have a Dream, or if you heard the Riverside speech, you'll know that as in the late 60s, Dr. King started to speak out on more than just civil rights. It was about human rights. It was about extreme militarism. It was about the war in Vietnam. And he got it from all sides in terms of, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. You're going to cost the civil rights movement a lot of money and credibility. You're a communist. I mean, there's so much that we don't know about what he stood for in the years before his death. And those are the things that much more likely got him killed than what he had been doing in his entirety of the, leading the civil rights movement. So just learning more, just hearing more of his words, I was like, man, that's not something that I hear on the commercials, right? Yeah. Like, that's not something I hear, when every year when we celebrate his birthday or Black History Month. You'll hear it in pockets of social media. You'll see, a few people trying to promote that, but there needed to be a bigger effort in order to get his true words out there, and the circumstances surrounding his death. I mean, anyone who can, just the simple fact that anytime Dr. King went to Memphis, he had a Black security detail that watched over him. And not only was that all Black security detail told not to report on the day before and the day of his assassination, but the 2 Black firefighters stationed across the street from the Lorraine Motel and the 1 Black detective who was doing surveillance on Dr. King were all pulled off the job. Those are 3 separate instances that all happened within 24 hours, the day of his death, that can't be ignored. And that's one very small fact. I was just talking to someone and telling them about all the crazy things that I've learned in making this podcast. And I said, in another podcast, you might find 5 things that are inconsistent, and you put those things together and you're like, something went on here and we need to expose it. There are like 100 of those things in the MLK tapes, and it just can't be ignored. I think people don't realize that in 93, there was a televised trial of James Earl Ray on HBO. It was a mock trial, but it was a real jury. It was a real prosecutor. And it was William Pepper, who was not only James Earl Ray's attorney, but was also the attorney for the King family in 1999 for the civil trial. And William Pepper was also the person who was Dr. King's friend during the last year of his life, who really helped exposed some of the things that were happening in Vietnam, which helped inform Dr. King's opinion on the Vietnam War. And so you have one man who's was friends with Dr. King, represented James Earl Ray, the accused murder of Dr. King, and represented the King family in a civil suit. So, and who did decades worth of investigating, which is all in this podcast. So if you really look at what what all these different trials mean, and the fact that we don't really know that they existed or what their outcome was, is really telling. And I think a lot of people just don't realize how much information is hiding in plain sight, because when you really promote one thing heavily, you convince a entire world or community that they know it, and they don't have to seek any more information. But if you just looked for more information, it's there. Some of it's hiding in plain sight. Others we're exposing in the podcast for the first time.
Yeah, sometimes those things where you might describe as, learning those people that were taken off the case, it feels shocking. And then when you pause, you're like, but maybe it's not that surprising, given the time and given things that were happening. And like you said, it's all right there. And it's just fascinating. There are a couple of things that I always marvel at Tenderfoot's ability within storytelling. One, and you and I have talked about this a little bit before, is the setup episode, that episode 1 where there is so much to say to try to bring a listener into this story. Because like you said, most people coming into this story know 2 or 3 facts about either a famous speech or the fact that he was assassinated and who assassinated him. And that's sort of the end of the story. And to be able to pull all of this together in a way to sort of tee it all up in episode 1 is just amazing to me. And then the other thing that I think you guys do so remarkably well, you mentioned Bill Pepper. And so not to be confused with Bill Claver, who is obviously our storyteller here, but Bill Pepper, who defended James Earl Ray after having been a close friend of Dr. King, of capturing these scenes or these moments, because I can't imagine what it would have been like that first time to have been a friend of Dr. King and then to have to walk in and see face to face the person that you go in assuming was the sole actor, the assassin in that case. And to be able to have that conversation, and you guys capture that in that episode just so beautifully. So it's remarkable to see that. But curious to hear from you in putting this podcast together. It was a long time in the works, over a year, like I said. Can you talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges in creating this podcast in particular?
Yeah, this one presented challenges that we really never had to consider before, because you're dealing with such a huge and important figure in world history, and you're dealing with so much information, which is why we had to do episode 1 the way we did. We had to really let people know, number one, I'm not telling you a bunch of stuff that you already know. And that's my first fear was that people would think, I already know about this, I don't want to listen. So we had to tell them so much in the first 5 minutes and then in the entire episode that really made them feel like, wow, I take that back, I don't know anything, so I need to keep listening. So episode 1 really had to pack in who, what you thought you knew, what you should have known about Dr. King, and then introduce characters like who is William Pepper, this friend of Dr. King's. We introduced, Isaac Ferris, who was Dr. King's nephew, and give some, kind of some family history there and how they ended up connecting with Bill Pepper. And then we have to introduce the HBO trial, which is something that a lot of people don't know about, even though, like I said, it aired on HBO in '93, and the outcome of the civil trial. So we spanned, from 68 to about 99 in the first episode. And it to really give you an idea of how big this is and how many moving parts there are, so that then we could go back and say, okay, we talked about all these things. Now we're going to dissect all these things. Now you're going to hear from James Earl Ray when he, spoke at the civil trial, or at the HBO trial. I'm sorry, at the HBO trial. He was already passed by the time of the civil trial. But so we now go back and dissect all these moments, and now we prove to you all the things that have been asserted in episode 1. You hear from these firefighters. You hear from the Black police officers, and you hear from people who were there. You hear from people who literally say on tape, like, I know because I was there. I was supposed to kill James Earl Ray. I was there when I heard this guy say on the phone, this mobster say on the phone, shoot him on the balcony. Like there are so many elements that people that come from people who's having firsthand accounts of saying, hey, I heard this thing, not, and it's not like you're hearing it in this year, right? We have tape from the 90s when people, and reports where someone heard something, reported it like back in 69, and then spoke about it for the first time publicly or on tape in the 90s. So there's a paper trail, not just a made up story and someone inserting themselves into the story. There are breadcrumbs to follow that give these stories, credibility. So it was really difficult in just taking all this information and we couldn't just tell a linear story, because it would take so long to get to the 99 civil trial or the 93 HBO trial. So we had to mix up the storytelling. And that was the most difficult part of really figuring it out. But I mean, great producers and writers on this show. Bill Klaver is an amazing host, amazing researcher and writer. So it was really a team effort between Tenderfoot, iHeart, and Bill, and both Bills, to really put this thing together.
Well, I know our crew just loves working with you guys. For those watching and listening here, we've got a team dedicated to our partnership with Tenderfoot, because we make so many podcasts together, and this was just an incredibly rewarding one for the team to be able to work on. I'm thrilled we were able to launch it when we did, right around MLK weekend, and to be able to come out of that weekend seeing that the show was resonating, and to see the support from many of the platforms out there, that prime promotion from partners like Apple, really giving it the promotion that it deserves. So remarkable to see it, and thank you guys for working on it. Before we let you go, I mean, what do we have coming up in these next few episodes? You touched on it a little bit, but anything else we should be ready for?
Yeah, I mean, so much. I'm like, in my mind, I'm like in episode 9 or something, just because as we're listening through and like QAing episodes. But coming up, there's a lot. We're gonna talk to so many people who, like I said, firsthand accounts of being there and talking about the bullet. Like the gun is a big issue of and that's already been discussed, when the gun was purchased, where, how it ended up there on the street, is that the gun. But now there's an entire other conversation about the actual bullet. And, you get the chance to hear from the forensic experts who extracted that bullet and who examined that bullet, who testified in court. And I think it's strange to me to feel like we're not like breaking news that this stuff exists. It's there. Like I said, just it's not being promoted in a way that makes the average person understand what the stakes are and what went wrong and what actually happened, right? So we're just using this opportunity to really like reframe and re-educate the masses, hopefully, in terms of like understanding that there's more here than meets the eye. And if you just rely on the official story, in many cases, including this one, you're likely being told a story that isn't completely true. And in this case is hardly true at all. You know what I mean? And so a lot more of that, you're going to hear a lot more about all the players in the conspiracy that, end up turning on each other, and multiple confessions to people who are not part of the conspiracy, which brings credibility for me when a regular person hears a confession and then reports that. They have nothing to gain from that. So to me, there's so many credible people who've heard things over these years and reported them after hearing them, that I think people will need to really understand how big that is and how much that should influence their opinion of what happened.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating, if tragic, part of our history, and important for us to be looking back on, and appreciate the work you guys are doing on that. So again, if you guys have not checked it out, it's the MLK tapes. You can see it at the top of the charts right now. Check it out. And Donald, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I definitely appreciate it. iHeart, you guys have supported us for the longest. The first company when you guys were How Stuff Works to really invest in and believe in Tenderfoot and wanting to do the Atlanta Child Murders, Atlanta Monster Project with us. So, our most trusted creative partner in the space. So I appreciate you guys always believing in us.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next week.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.